Welcome to Unit 1, Literature in the Early American and Colonial Time Period. The literature in this time period was largely ignored by many when they were first written. The authors of this time had unique challenges to publishing their work. First, there were not many publishers in the United States at the time, so many had to rely on English printers to publish bound copies of their work. Even in Europe, publishing was still gaining traction and books were still expensive to produce and purchase. So when you add having to send your manuscript across the ocean, wait, have them come back with whether or not they accept your manuscript, give that communication going back and forth across the ocean about how to do it and the purchase and everything, it was a complicated process to publish. Some of that you will study in this unit were not published until over a century after their original manuscript was written. One of these, in fact, was the very first one you'll be reading, of Plymouth Plantation. It was written somewhere between 1630 and 1651 and preserved in Boston, but not published. During the Revolutionary War, it disappeared, only to reappear in the Bishop of London's library almost 50 years later, and finally put into print in 1856. After a court battle to return the manuscript to the United States, the original journal was finally presented to the governor of Massachusetts in 1897. Now, most literature of this time focused on four main genres, or types of literature. The first genre is the autobiography. This was a time of great change and adventure, and the novel had yet to become popular. But personal accounts were very popular. In this unit, you'll be reading the autobiographies of William Bradford and Ulloa Equiano, which is an example of a slave narrative that would become very popular through the next century. Another genre that was popular at the time was poetry. Poetry was frequently used for fictional storytelling before the novel became popular, as well as expressing personal experiences and feelings. It was also a genre in which the authors from both genders could receive acclaim. Two women, Anne Bradstreet and a slave girl named Phyllis Wheatley, demonstrate this. Both were praised in the United States for their writing, but it was in Europe that their thoughts gained the greatest traction and popularity. Sermons became a popular genre during this time period as well. Popular ministers could publish their sermons to be shared with other ministers, and some of these collections became quite popular and well known. The most famous from this time period is probably Jonathan Edwards and his sermon, A Sinner in the Hands of an Angry God. Most of his audience would have heard his sermon repeated to great effect by their own ministers, who read his sermons to them. And because of the power of his language and that of other ministers of the time, the first Great Awakening broke out in the United States as the colonies experienced a large-scale revival. The final genre that had a huge impact was political publications and tracts. Probably none were as influential as the writings of Thomas Paine, whose common sense is credited by many as a deciding argument to join against England and leading to his friend Thomas Jefferson to draft the Declaration of Independence. Now, many of you may notice that most of these authors that we will be studying are from the northern colonies. Part of the reason for this was the emphasis on education that these colonies had in their region in comparison to the southern colonies, where education was less universal. In the South, even rich landowners may or may not have a very good education. Now, you can thank the values of the northern colonies for the universal education system that you enjoy today, for their emphasis on learning and education for all. They not only gave us the great literature from a diversity of genders and races from this time period, but they also created a value of education that Americans have to this day. Now, the authors of this time also started our country on the path to the values of a Republican democracy that we enjoy today. They set a new standard of government that came out of their values of individual rights and the role of government in society. Now, you may find that the language of these authors is just a little bit harder to understand. Remember that many of these authors grew up on the King James Bible, and some were even contemporaries of Shakespeare. However, you will also find the Puritans had a value of simple and straightforward language, which should help you overcome some of these other difficulties. If you struggle with understanding the language of these selections, be sure to use the resources provided you to strengthen your comprehension of these authors. I hope you enjoy reading about the unique experiences and the ideas that these authors present, and to be inspired by the influence that they have had on our culture to this day.